It was a bright spring morning at Reagan National Airport, with sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows and the usual bustle of travelers hurrying to their gates. Among them was a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, dressed in a crisp navy blue polo shirt and khaki slacks. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and despite his casual attire, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that came from decades of military service. As one of the few black admirals in the U.S. Navy's history, he had broken countless barriers throughout his 30-year career. Today, however, he wasn't thinking about military operations or command responsibilities. His mind was on his daughter, who was about to graduate from medical school in San Francisco. The thought of watching her walk across that stage brought a warm smile to his face as he wheeled his carry-on luggage toward the check-in counter. Looking at his watch, he noticed he'd arrived with plenty of time to spare, a habit ingrained from years of military precision. The first-class ticket had been a special splurge for this important occasion. His daughter had insisted on buying it for him, saying, "Dad, you've flown military transport long enough. Time for some comfort." As he approached the check-in counter, he noticed something odd. The gate agent's welcoming smile, so readily offered to the previous passengers, suddenly became fixed and artificial. Her eyes darted to his casual clothes, then to his ticket, then back to him. The Admiral had seen that look before, the subtle shift in expression, the slight hesitation. After 3 decades of service, he'd learned to read these minor changes in behavior like a weather map. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, sliding his ticket and ID across the counter. "I'm checking in for the San Francisco flight." His voice carried the warm tone of someone used to putting others at ease, despite any tension in the air. The gate agent picked up his documents with noticeably less enthusiasm than she'd shown the previous customers. "One moment, sir," she said, her fingers tapping on her keyboard with exaggerated focus. "I'm seeing some issues with your reservation." The Admiral raised an eyebrow slightly but maintained his composed demeanor. He'd faced far more challenging situations than this throughout his career. While other passengers moved smoothly through the check-in process around him, he stood patiently, watching as the agent made several unnecessary phone calls and repeatedly checked her computer screen. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Dad, I can't wait to see you. The whole family's so excited." He smiled at the message, choosing to focus on the joy ahead rather than the frustration of the moment. Still, he couldn't help but notice how the agent efficiently processed 2 other first-class passengers who had arrived after him, both wearing expensive suits, both white. The morning light continued to brighten the terminal as more passengers arrived, creating a growing line behind him. Some began to shuffle impatiently, checking their watches and sighing. The Admiral remained unruffled, his military training evident in his steady stance and calm expression. He'd learned long ago that maintaining composure was often the most powerful response to prejudice. Little did the gate agent know that the man standing before her had commanded naval vessels, led thousands of sailors, and helped shape military policy at the Pentagon. For now, he simply waited, knowing from experience that sometimes the most impactful responses come not from immediate confrontation, but from letting situations unfold at their own pace. The morning was young, and this was just the beginning of what would prove to be a very interesting journey to San Francisco. The real trouble began when boarding time arrived. The Admiral stood patiently in the first-class line, boarding pass in hand, watching as other passengers filed past the gate. That's when he noticed something odd. A young businessman in an expensive gray suit was being handed a boarding pass for seat 2A. The Admiral glanced down at his own ticket, seat 2A. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward with the same calm authority he used countless times on naval vessels. "I believe there might be a mix-up. That's my assigned seat." The gate agent's face flushed slightly as she shuffled through some papers. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, but it seems the flight was overbooked. We had to make some adjustments to accommodate our priority passengers." The businessman, already clutching his new boarding pass, barely glanced in their direction before hurrying down the jet bridge. The Admiral noticed how the agent hadn't asked to see the businessman's original booking or questioned his priority status. "I understand the challenges of overbooking," the Admiral replied, his voice steady but firm. "However, I booked this seat 3 months ago, and I have a confirmed first-class ticket." He pulled out his phone, showing her the confirmation email. The gate agent's smile remained fixed as she typed frantically into her computer. "Well, you see, sir, there appears to be a computer error in our system. These things happen sometimes." Her voice carried that artificial sweetness that poorly masked underlying dismissal. Other first-class passengers continued boarding while the Admiral stood at the counter. An older couple received their boarding passes with warm smiles from the agent. A businesswoman in a designer suit was promptly processed through. Each time, the Admiral noticed how their documentation was barely glanced at before they were waved through with a cheerful, "Have a wonderful flight." His phone buzzed again. Another text from his daughter. "Dad, we're planning a special dinner for tomorrow. Mom says to make sure you don't eat airplane food." The thought of his family waiting in San Francisco helped him maintain his composure, even as his patience was being tested. A young man in line behind him started to notice what was happening. He kept looking between the Admiral and the gate agent, his brow furrowing as he picked up on the unfair treatment unfolding before him. The Admiral caught his eye briefly, giving him a small, knowing nod. "Perhaps we could speak with a supervisor," the Admiral suggested, his tone remaining professional. Years of commanding respect in the military had taught him that losing your cool never improved a situation. "The supervisor is quite busy at the moment," the gate agent replied quickly. "But I can offer you an economy seat now, and we can sort this out with customer service later." She started to print out a new boarding pass for a middle seat in the back of the plane. The Admiral placed his hand gently on the counter, not taking the economy boarding pass. "I appreciate you're trying to find a solution," he said, "but I don't understand why my confirmed first-class reservation suddenly became invalid while others are being processed without issue." The tension at the gate was becoming noticeable. Other passengers were whispering among themselves, some pulling out their phones, sensing that something wasn't right. The gate agent's hands began to shake slightly as she realized more people were watching the situation unfold. Decades of facing similar situations had taught the Admiral to stay calm but firm. He knew that his response in moments like these mattered not just for him, but for others who might face the same treatment in the future. He stood straight, arms relaxed at his sides, the same posture he maintained through countless storms at sea. The morning light caught his wedding ring as he reached for his wallet, deciding it was time to show another form of identification. Sometimes, he'd learned, you had to light a small flame to illuminate the darkness of prejudice. The minutes ticked by at the gate counter, each one adding to the growing tension in the air. The Admiral stood quietly, watching as more passengers made their way through the boarding process. A businessman rushed up late, apologizing profusely about losing track of time, and the gate agent promptly processed his first-class ticket with a bright smile. "Oh, don't worry about it at all, sir. We're just happy you made it." The contrast couldn't have been more clear. The Admiral thought about all the young sailors he mentored over the years, especially the ones who'd faced similar situations. He always told them, "Your dignity is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond to that treatment." A flight attendant walking past the gate did a double take, noticing the unusual scene. She slowed her pace, trying to understand why a well-dressed older gentleman was being kept waiting while other passengers breezed through. The Admiral caught her questioning glance and gave her a slight, knowing smile. "Sir," the gate agent said, shuffling more papers on her desk, "I'm still trying to verify your booking status. Perhaps you'd like to take a seat while we sort this out?" She gestured to the nearby chairs, clearly hoping to move him away from the counter and out of sight. The Admiral remained standing, his posture relaxed but firm. "I appreciate your suggestion," he replied calmly, "but I'd prefer to resolve this now." My daughter's graduation ceremony is tomorrow, and this is the last direct flight that would get me there in time. More passengers had begun to notice the situation. A young couple whispered to each other, their faces showing concern. An elderly woman shook her head disapprovingly at the gate agent's behavior. The Admiral could feel the energy shifting in the terminal as people began to recognize the unfairness playing out before them. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was his wife. Remember to take pictures of the sunset from the plane. The view from first class over the mountains is supposed to be amazing. The irony of the message wasn't lost on him. The flight attendant who had passed earlier was now talking quietly with another crew member, both of them glancing over periodically. The Admiral had seen this pattern before, people slowly recognizing injustice and deciding whether to speak up or stay quiet. "I've double-checked our system," the gate agent announced, her voice slightly higher than before. "And it seems there was a priority override on your seat assignment." She wouldn't meet his eyes as she spoke, focusing intently on her computer screen. "Could you explain what qualifies as a priority override?" The Admiral asked, his tone carrying the same steady authority he'd used in countless military briefings. "I'm quite familiar with airline policies, and I've never heard of this superseding a confirmed first-class booking." A small crowd had formed nearby, pretending to check their phones or read magazines while actually watching the scene unfold. The Admiral noticed a few people filming discreetly with their phones. In today's world, moments like these rarely stayed private. The gate agent's fingers trembled slightly as she typed, clearly aware of the growing audience. "Well, you see, sir, it's a complex system." Her voice trailed off as she struggled to fabricate a plausible explanation. Through the terminal windows, the Admiral could see their plane being prepared for departure. Ground crew members moved efficiently around the aircraft, loading luggage and checking systems. Everything was running according to schedule, except for this one computer error that seemed to affect only him. He thought about his 30 years of service, the countless times he'd navigated delicate situations on international waters, negotiated with foreign officials, and commanded respect through presence rather than force. This moment, though different, required the same skills: patience, dignity, and strategic thinking. The young man who had noticed earlier was now openly watching, his own boarding pass forgotten in his hand. The Admiral could see in his eyes the same look he'd seen in young officers witnessing injustice for the first time, that mix of disbelief, anger, and uncertainty about how to respond. A familiar sound echoed through the terminal, heavy, measured footsteps approaching from the direction of the cockpit. The Admiral didn't need to turn around to recognize the walk of a fellow military man. Sometimes, he reflected, timing was everything in these situations. The situation at the gate reached its breaking point when the gate agent slid an economy class ticket across the counter. "This is the best we can do for now, sir," she said with forced politeness. "We can discuss compensation for the downgrade after you reach San Francisco." The Admiral looked down at the ticket. 32E, a middle seat in the back of the plane. He thought about his daughter's thoughtfulness in booking him a comfortable first-class seat, knowing how his old knee injury from Naval Academy days still bothered him on long flights. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need volume to command attention. "I'd like you to explain why my confirmed first-class reservation was given to another passenger who arrived after me." The young flight attendant who had noticed earlier stepped closer to the counter. She'd been watching the situation unfold while pretending to organize boarding passes, and something about the unfairness of it all had struck a chord. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her eyes moving between the Admiral and the gate agent. "Everything's fine," the gate agent said quickly, too quickly. "We're just handling a routine seating adjustment." Her hands were shaking slightly as she shuffled more papers, avoiding eye contact with both of them. The flight attendant frowned. "I couldn't help but notice this gentleman has been waiting here for quite a while. Perhaps I should get the pilot. He's just finishing his pre-flight checks." More passengers had gathered nearby, creating an audience that made the gate agent increasingly nervous. A businessman who had boarded earlier came back out to the gate area, looking confused. "Excuse me," he said, "but I think there's been a mistake. I was just given a first-class seat, but another passenger's belongings were already there." The Admiral remained silent, watching as the situation began to unravel on its own. Through the years, he'd learned that sometimes the most powerful move was to simply stand your ground and let truth emerge naturally. An elderly couple who had witnessed everything from the beginning started speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Did you see how they treated him?" the woman whispered to her husband. "And after they just let everyone else through without any questions." The gate agent's face had turned an uncomfortable shade of red. She reached for her phone, presumably to call a supervisor, but her hands were trembling so much she nearly dropped it. "Sir, if you could just take the economy seat for now." The Admiral took a deep breath, reminded of countless moments throughout his career when patience and composure had served him better than confrontation. His phone buzzed again. Another text from his daughter. "Dad, my friends can't wait to meet you. They're so excited to hear your stories about commanding ships." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had commanded vessels worth billions and crews of thousands, being denied the seat his daughter had thoughtfully purchased for him. The young flight attendant had pulled out her tablet and was checking something. "According to our records," she said firmly, "this first-class ticket was purchased 3 months ago. I don't understand why there would be any issue with the seat assignment." The terminal had grown unusually quiet, with nearby passengers hardly even pretending to mind their own business anymore. Several phones were pointed in their direction, recording the scene. The Admiral knew from experience that moments like these often became catalysts for broader conversations about dignity and respect. Through the large terminal windows, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the gate area. The Admiral could see their plane waiting at the gate, its engines starting their pre-flight checks. Time was running short before departure, and something had to give. That's when he heard those measured footsteps growing closer, the unmistakable sound of the pilot's approach. The Admiral reached for his wallet, where he kept his military ID behind his regular driver's license. Sometimes, he reflected, a quiet revelation could speak louder than any argument. The gate agent was still fumbling with papers, trying to maintain her composure, when the pilot's voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The moment of truth had arrived. The pilot stood there in his crisp uniform, reading the tension in the air. His eyes moved from the gate agent's flustered expression to the Admiral's composed stance, taking in the scene with professional interest. "What seems to be the issue with this passenger seat?" The gate agent started her rehearsed explanation. There was a computer error with the booking system. But her voice trailed off as the Admiral calmly reached into his pocket. The moment had come. Without saying a word, he pulled out his military ID card. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal windows caught the gold trim of the credential case as he opened it. The pilot's eyes widened slightly as they fell on the insignia. "Rear Admiral, United States Navy," the pilot read aloud, his posture automatically straightening. Being a former Navy officer himself, he knew exactly what those stars represented: decades of service, countless sacrifices, and a level of leadership few achieved. The terminal fell completely silent. The businessman who had been given the Admiral's seat shifted uncomfortably near the gate. The gate agent's face had gone from red to pale as the reality of her actions sank in. "Sir," the pilot said, snapping to attention out of pure instinct, "I apologize for this situation. I served as a lieutenant in the Navy before joining the airline." His voice carried genuine respect, not just for the rank, but for what it represented, especially for a black officer who had risen to such heights. The young flight attendant who had tried to help earlier couldn't hide her smile. She'd suspected there was more to this quiet, dignified man than the gate agent had assumed. Other passengers watched in amazement as the scene unfolded, many of them finally understanding the full weight of the discrimination they'd witnessed. At ease, the Admiral said kindly to the pilot, his voice carrying the warm authority of someone used to putting others at comfort. "I wasn't planning to mention my rank. I simply wanted to get to my daughter's graduation in the seat she thoughtfully purchased for me." The pilot turned to the gate agent, his expression now stern. "Please explain why a rear admiral's confirmed first-class reservation was given away while other passengers were allowed to board without question." The gate agent stammered, I didn't know. The system. The system showed my confirmed reservation from 3 months ago." The Admiral completed her sentence gently. "Just as it did when you processed other first-class passengers who arrived after me." The elderly couple who had been watching everything exchanged knowing looks. The wife whispered to her husband, 30 years of service and still has to deal with this kind of treatment." Her words, though quiet, carried across the now silent gate area. A teenager who had been recording the whole thing on his phone whispered to his mother, "Mom, do you know how hard it is to become an admiral?" And especially, his mother squeezed his arm, nodding in understanding. The pilot took charge of the situation. "Sir, if you'll allow me to escort you to your rightful seat personally. And I believe there's a gentleman in Tua who needs to be relocated to his actual assigned seat." The businessman who had taken the Admiral's seat quickly gathered his belongings, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The other passengers watched as karma unfolded in real time, some nodding in satisfaction. As the Admiral finally moved toward the jet bridge, his phone buzzed one last time. His daughter had sent a photo of her graduation robes, freshly pressed for tomorrow's ceremony. The sight reminded him of why he'd maintained his composure throughout the ordeal. Every battle he'd fought in his career had been to make paths easier for the next generation, including his own children. The pilot walked beside him, sharing a brief story about his own Navy service. Behind them, they could hear the gate agent being called aside by her supervisor. The morning sun painted long shadows across the terminal floor as justice, delayed but not denied, finally took its proper course. This moment, the Admiral knew, would become another story in his collection, not one of anger or resentment, but of how dignity and truth had their own quiet power. The aftermath of the revelation rippled through the terminal like waves after a stone hits water. The airline staff scrambled to correct their mistake, with an urgency that was almost comical compared to their earlier dismissiveness. The businessman who had been given the Admiral's seat was now being escorted to his proper place in economy class, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I really must apologize again, Admiral," the pilot said as they walked down the jet bridge together. "I started my career under a black commanding officer in the Navy. He taught me more about leadership than any manual ever could." The pilot's voice carried genuine respect, not the forced politeness from earlier at the gate. Behind them, they could hear the rushed whispers of other passengers sharing what they'd witnessed. "Did you see? He's an admiral. Can you believe how they treated him before they knew?" The murmurs followed them like a gentle wake behind a ship. The young flight attendant who had tried to help earlier hurried ahead to prepare the Admiral's rightful seat. She was straightening the first-class cabin with extra care, her movements reflecting both embarrassment for her company's behavior and determination to make things right. As they reached the aircraft door, the Admiral paused briefly, looking at the plane's interior. He'd flown countless times, commanded massive naval vessels, yet this simple flight to his daughter's graduation had turned into an unexpected lesson for everyone involved. "Your seat has been restored, sir," the flight attendant announced, her voice carrying a mix of respect and lingering apologetic tones. "I've made sure everything is exactly as it should be." She gestured to 2A, now properly prepared with fresh pillows and a neatly folded blanket. Other first-class passengers watched the scene unfold, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they realized they'd been processed through while this distinguished officer was made to wait. An elderly businessman in 2B stood up and offered his hand to the Admiral. "Sir, I watched what happened at the gate," he said quietly. My father served in the Navy too. He would have been proud to see how you handled that situation with such dignity. The genuine emotion in his voice touched everyone within earshot. The pilot ensured the Admiral was properly settled before heading to the cockpit. I'll be making a slight adjustment to our announcements today, he said with a meaningful look. Some recognition is in order. As the Admiral sat down, his phone lit up with another message from his daughter. Just finished decorating my graduation cap, Dad. Can't wait for you to see it. He smiled, thinking how this incident would become another teaching moment to share with her about maintaining grace under pressure. The other passengers were still boarding, and many slowed down as they passed through first class, stealing glances at the Admiral. Some nodded respectfully, others smiled warmly. The atmosphere had shifted completely from the tense scene at the gate. The gate agent's supervisor appeared at the aircraft door, slightly out of breath from rushing down the jet bridge. Admiral, sir, she said, I want to personally assure you that we'll be conducting a full investigation into what happened today. This is not what our airline stands for. The Admiral nodded graciously. I appreciate that, he said, though I hope the focus will be on prevention rather than punishment. Sometimes the best response to bias is education. His words carried the weight of someone who had faced similar situations throughout his career and chose to turn them into opportunities for change. From his window seat, he could see the gate area where the scene had unfolded just minutes ago. The morning sun had risen higher now, erasing the shadows from the terminal floor. He thought about all the young officers he mentored over the years, how he taught them that true leadership wasn't about the stars on your shoulder, but about how you carried yourself when those stars weren't visible. The cabin crew began their pre-flight preparations, moving with extra attentiveness around the first-class cabin. The incident had transformed into something more than just a seating dispute. It had become a powerful reminder about judgment, respect, and the quiet strength of dignity. As the last passengers boarded, the Admiral settled into his seat, thinking about tomorrow's graduation ceremony and the proud moment awaiting him. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important victories were won not through confrontation, but through maintaining one's dignity in the face of prejudice. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the pilot's voice came over the intercom with an unusual warmth. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're honored to have with us a distinguished passenger, a Rear Admiral of the United States Navy. On behalf of our entire crew, we thank you for your service, sir. A spontaneous round of applause broke out through the cabin. The Admiral smiled quietly, nodding in acknowledgement. The recognition wasn't what he'd sought, but he understood its importance, not for him, but for others who might face similar situations. The flight attendant who had stood up for him earlier approached with a tablet in hand. Sir, our main office has already been notified of the incident. They'd like to offer you lifetime premium status with the airline. She paused, then added more personally, though I know that doesn't really address what happened. You're right, the Admiral replied gently. Status upgrades don't solve the underlying issue. But you know what does make a difference? People like you who speak up when they see something wrong. The young woman's eyes brightened at his words, recognizing their truth. A passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged teacher by profession, leaned over. I've been teaching my students about civil rights, she said quietly. Would you mind if I shared your story with them? Not about the airline's mistake, but about how you handled it with such grace. The Admiral thought about this for a moment. Tell them it's not about tolerating disrespect, he responded. It's about knowing your worth so deeply that another person's prejudice can't shake it. Through the window, the landscape below had transformed into a patchwork of fields and cities. The Admiral pulled out his laptop, opening a blank email. He'd been considering how to address what happened, not out of anger, but as an opportunity for change. Dear Customer Relations, he began typing. I'm writing not to complain, but to suggest. Today's incident at Reagan National reveals not just one person's bias, but a system that allows such bias to affect customer service. The elderly businessman from 2B watched him typing. "You're being very kind in that email," he observed. "Most people would be demanding someone be fired." The Admiral paused his typing. "In 30 years of service, I've learned that firing people rarely fixes problems. Training them, educating them, helping them understand, that creates real change." The flight crew had been providing extra attentive service, but not in the nervous, overcompensating way that often follows such incidents. Instead, they showed genuine respect, inspired by how the Admiral had handled the situation. His phone buzzed again, this time a message from his wife. "Your daughter's so excited about tomorrow, she's barely sleeping." He smiled, thinking how this story would add to their family's collection of teaching moments. The young flight attendant returned with a fresh cup of coffee. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what happened. I'm starting crew leader training next month, and I wondered, would you share some leadership advice?" The Admiral gestured for her to sit in the empty seat beside him. "The most important thing I've learned about leadership," he said, "is that it's not about the rank or title. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching your stars." As they talked, other passengers listened discreetly, absorbing lessons that went far beyond airline service or military command. The Admiral shared stories about his early days in the Navy, about facing discrimination with dignity, and about turning obstacles into opportunities for education. "You know," he mused, looking out at the clouds, "sometimes the hardest part of leadership is choosing how to respond when people underestimate you. Every reaction becomes a teaching moment, whether you intend it or not." The flight continued smoothly, but something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. What had started as an unfortunate incident of bias had transformed into an impromptu masterclass in dignity, leadership, and the power of measured responses. As they passed over the Midwest, the Admiral finished his email to the airline. He ended it not with demands or complaints, but with an offer to help develop better training programs. Sometimes, he knew, the best way to navigate through storms was to become the lighthouse that helps others find their way. As the plane soared over the Rocky Mountains, the Admiral found himself reflecting on similar moments throughout his career. Each challenge, each subtle slight, each barrier had shaped not just his path, but his approach to leadership. The view from 35,000 feet had a way of putting things in perspective. The young flight attendant returned with a fresh pot of coffee, her earlier nervousness replaced by genuine interest. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly, "but during my break, I posted about what happened today. Not the negative part, but how you handled it. It's already getting hundreds of shares." The Admiral smiled, watching as she poured his coffee with careful attention. "Social media has a way of amplifying moments," he observed. "Let's hope what spreads is not the incident, but the lesson in it." A passenger who had witnessed everything at the gate had been typing furiously on his laptop for the past hour. He was a journalist for an online news site, and the story had struck a chord. "Sir," he said, leaning across the aisle, "would you mind if I wrote about this? People need to hear about leadership like yours." The Admiral considered this carefully. "If you write it," he replied, "focus on the bigger picture. This isn't about one airline or one incident. It's about how we choose to respond when faced with prejudice and how those choices ripple out to affect others." His phone buzzed with another message, this time from a former shipmate. "Just saw a viral post about what happened at the airport. Still teaching us all how it's done, Admiral." The news was spreading faster than the plane was flying. Looking out the window, he remembered a similar incident early in his career, long before he had stars on his shoulders. A young officer then, he'd been denied entry to an officers' club because the guard didn't believe he was military. His commanding officer had witnessed it and turned it into a teaching moment for the entire base. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a personal touch. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we fly over the Rockies, I'm reminded of something I learned in the Navy. The view from the top is earned not just by how high you climb, but by how many people you bring up with you." Several passengers nodded, understanding the reference. The Admiral's quiet dignity had turned what could have been an ugly confrontation into a lesson in leadership that none of them would soon forget. Opening his laptop again, he began drafting notes for his next mentoring session with young officers. Today's experience would become part of his teaching curriculum, not as a complaint about discrimination, but as a masterclass in turning confrontation into conversation. The elderly businessman from earlier caught his eye. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "my granddaughter just joined the Navy. She's worried about facing prejudice as a woman in uniform. Would you mind if I shared your story with her?" "Tell her something I learned over 30 years," the Admiral responded warmly. "Our uniform isn't just what we wear. It's how we carry ourselves, especially when others don't see or respect the rank we've earned." The story was taking on a life of its own. Passengers were sharing it on various social media platforms, each adding their own perspective on what they'd witnessed. But unlike many viral stories of discrimination, this one carried a different message, one of dignity, leadership, and the power of measured response. The young flight attendant returned once more, this time with a logbook. "Our crew would be honored if you'd sign this," she said. "We want to remember this flight not for what went wrong, but for what we learned about true leadership." As he signed the logbook, the Admiral thought about tomorrow's graduation ceremony. His daughter would be receiving her medical degree, breaking her own barriers, fighting her own battles. He'd always taught her that education was the most powerful response to prejudice, and today had proven that lesson once again. The sun was starting to set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important victories weren't won through confrontation, but through turning moments of prejudice into opportunities for progress. Within days of the flight landing in San Francisco, the story had taken on a life far beyond that morning at Reagan National. The video clips, shared by multiple passengers, had sparked something bigger than just another viral moment of injustice. Instead, it had become a powerful lesson in dignity and leadership. The airline's corporate office issued a public statement that morning. "We deeply regret the treatment our distinguished passenger received. This incident has prompted a complete overhaul of our training programs. The Admiral's graceful handling of the situation has taught us all a valuable lesson." But the real impact was happening at ground level. The young flight attendant's social media post had reached military bases across the country. Young officers were sharing it in their training sessions, discussing not the discrimination, but the Admiral's response to it. "Dad, you're trending." His daughter had laughed at her graduation dinner, showing him her phone. The Admiral smiled, remembering how she'd hugged him extra tight after hearing about what happened. "You just gave my graduation speech more meaning," she'd whispered. A week later, the Admiral received an unexpected email from the gate agent who had caused the initial problem. Her message was simple but sincere. "Your response to my behavior taught me more than any sensitivity training ever could. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know that you've changed how I see things." The airline had indeed followed through on their promises. They'd invited the Admiral to help design a new training program, focusing not just on avoiding discrimination, but on recognizing and valuing every customer's dignity. "Sometimes the best teachers are those we've wronged," the training director had admitted. The story reached the Naval Academy, where it quickly became part of the leadership curriculum. A professor there used it as a case study in his ethics class, asking students to consider how they would handle similar situations. "Notice," he would tell them, "how the Admiral's response educated rather than humiliated." During his next mentoring session with young officers, the Admiral found himself facing a larger crowd than usual. They weren't there to hear about naval strategy or military protocol. They wanted to know how to maintain dignity in the face of prejudice, how to turn discrimination into teaching moments. "The stars on my shoulder weren't what commanded respect that day," he told them. "It was the way I carried myself before anyone knew about those stars. That's the true measure of leadership." The journalist who'd been on the flight published his article, focusing not on the scandal, but on the lesson. In an era where viral videos usually showcase confrontation, he wrote, "This one shows us the quiet power of dignity." The elderly businessman who'd witnessed everything kept his promise. His granddaughter in the Navy wrote to the Admiral, sharing how his story had given her new strategies for handling bias in her own career. "Your example showed me that our strongest response to prejudice is our professional excellence," she wrote. The young flight attendant who had spoken up that day was promoted to crew trainer. She often started her sessions by sharing what she learned from the Admiral. True service means seeing the dignity in every person, regardless of appearance or assumptions. Back at his office in the Pentagon, the Admiral added a new photo to his wall. Him with his daughter at her graduation, both beaming with pride. Below it, he placed the airline's letter announcing their new training program. Together, they told a story not of victimhood, but of victory through dignity. Months later, at a military leadership conference, someone asked him if he regretted not being more confrontational that day at the airport. The Admiral smiled and said, "The loudest response isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, the quietest response creates the most lasting change." The story continued to spread, not as a tale of discrimination, but as a lesson in leadership. It wasn't about the rank he held, but about how he held himself. It wasn't about the stars on his shoulder, but about the strength in his response. In the end, his dignified reaction had accomplished more than any confrontation could have. As he often told young officers now, your greatest power lies not in how you respond to respect, but in how you respond to disrespect. That's where true leadership shines through.